Hello, everybody. How are you today? Welcome to another episode of Learn with Dr. G. That's me. Today, we're going to be doing some more. Let me bring my microphone over here. Sorry, that was probably really quiet. We're going to be doing some more machine learning, and we're going to be using the Azure ML SDK. If you're watching on Twitch stream or YouTube, Twitch or YouTube, I am monitoring comments. So hello in the comments. So feel free to post. I'd love to chat with you. And we'll get started here in just a second. Sorry, I have to play that every time. I love it. So before we get started, I just want to remind you of our code of conduct here at Microsoft. And I love this view instead. It's basically just let's be kind, let's be friendly, let's be patient, aware, be open to questions and viewpoints, understanding of differences, and let's just have fun as we're learning today. As I mentioned, today we are going to be exploring some Azure machine learning, specifically how we can use the SDK. Last week, if you joined us, we were exploring how to use AutoML inside of the Azure ML Studio. And we are going to be revisiting that Azure ML Studio today. So let's jump right into it. The first thing that I did want to mention is that if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to check out the Azure Subscriptions. You can actually get free trials, both if you are a student, you get a different kind of free trial. So I'm going to paste that here in the comments. You can get a free trial that gives you access to a bunch of our resources, as well as some credits to use within Azure. And you don't need a credit card to sign up. And if you aren't a student, you can still get a free trial access. So if you want to follow along, I highly encourage you to sign up for Azure. And what we're going to do is head over to the Azure Portal today. Actually, before we get started, hello, everybody. Before we get started, I did want to mention that this stream and last week's stream was inspired by the Developers Intro to Data Science video series that I did with my friend Francesca, who also works here at Microsoft. There's also this Learn collection that we created. And this collection, let me put some banners up here, can be found at aka.ms/learnwithdrg/devintrodS-learn in the comments and on the screen. And it takes you here. And this is just 11 learning paths, 63 hours of content. It's not meant for you to sit down and just do it. It's meant to just be a resource for you to go explore as you're on your data science and machine learning journey. So we try to compile a lot of the resources that we have on Microsoft Learn for you. And you can see that some of these resources are actually part of some courses that we do in partnership with universities, like this one. This is a Foundations of Data Science course. You can see that it is in partnership with UC Berkeley. So if you're interested in data science and machine learning, I highly encourage you to check out some of these resources. And you can check out the video series that we did, same aka just dash videos, also in the comments and on the screen. And we walk through doing some machine learning and data science in Visual Studio Code and in Azure Machine Learning Studio. And I'll point that out as we go along today. So like I mentioned, we are going to be jumping into the Azure Portal. I am following one of the tutorials that we have available, which you can find at this link, aka.ms/learnwithdrg/Azure ML SDK 11. This tutorial just kind of walks you through doing some basic setup and trying things out. And it actually walks you through a different notebook. We're going to do something else today, but I just kind of wanted to point you to that resource in case you wanted to follow along. All right. So we're going to be jumping into the Azure Portal today. And I just realized this is the video series I meant to show you all. And this is that tutorial. I meant to show you all that as I was showing you. And this is what the Azure Portal looks like. You can find it at portal.azure.com. And I have already created the machine learning resource and run through our code. So I'll be pointing it out to you and kind of we'll be exploring it together. But I did that because we're actually running, like training a machine learning algorithm, and that takes, upwards of an hour, and I didn't want to waste all the time just sitting here training. So I've already created it. You can see about an hour ago it was updated. But I'll walk you through briefly how you would do this. So before you start any machine learning project if you want to use Azure resources, you need to head over to the portal because you need to get an Azure machine learning resource set up. You can do that by going into Create Resource and searching for machine learning, clicking on Create and filling out this form here. First, you just need to create a resource group. I personally like to create a new resource group for every kind of new project that I'm doing, especially if I'm just testing something out, because it allows me to ensure that I can clean up all of my resources when I'm done and I don't get hit with a bill afterwards or use up all of my free credits. So you create a new resource, you create a workspace, you choose the region that is closest to you. In this case, for me, it's West US. And when you do this, all these other things will appear. So for example, if we were to choose this resource and choose something like that, then all of these will automatically get created for you. Then you would just click on Review and Create, and it would be created. Once you do that, you'll be taken to your machine learning resource. Now, I highly recommend that you don't share this on a live stream. I will be deleting it right away, but it does have some information that might be useful for you as you're connecting up your Azure resources with your Python Jupyter notebooks. So there are a couple of ways that you can proceed from here. Basically, what we've done so far is we've created this Azure resource that is in the cloud / at a data center nearest to us, in my case, in the West US region. And this resource contains all of the data store, compute, just everything that I would need to be able to run and train and test my machine learning algorithms and code. So that's why that's the first thing that you need to do, because we need to create that space on a computer somewhere and be able to access it. To access it, one way, if you are going to be using Visual Studio Code, we're not going to do that today, and I'll show you kind of the differences there, is to download this config.json file. Basically, this config file just has your subscription ID, the resource ID, and I think that's pretty much it. I mean, it just kind of has, and we can look at it. I think it has your subscription ID. Did I already do that twice now? Well, anyways, it just has some basic information, and we can take a look at that in just a second. I'll point it out to you. So if you are going to be using Visual Studio Code, one fast way of doing it is by using the config file. Alternatively, you can launch the studio. So I've already launched my studio, and I'm going to get out of this view real quick because normally you'd be taken to this home page. Again, I've already done this run on purpose because I don't want to waste our entire hour doing this. This studio can be found at ml.azure.com. Yes, you can definitely still follow along. You might need to just sign up for a pay-as-you-go subscription. Unfortunately, you can't double down on multiple free subscriptions. So there was a question, in the comments about already using the free credit and still trying to follow along. The cost of this is very, very minimal, especially if you're going to follow along and then delete it immediately. But I understand that can be a blocker. So you can still follow along for the majority of kind of like what we're going to do in terms of the data cleansing and things like that and using Scikit-Learn. But I am demonstrating how to actually use the Azure ML SDK, in which case you do need an Azure subscription. All right. Thank you. I like little props. I appreciate that. So we're here at the Azure Machine Learning Studio. And if you didn't see last week's video, I encourage you to go check it out. You can actually check out all of the videos that I make by heading over to aka.ms/learn with Dr. G. I'll just put in here. I believe that the Azure Machine Learning resource creates the container registry for you that you would need. So if you're creating an Azure Machine Learning resource, you don't need to do anything else. Doesn't look like I created one, actually. Actually, now that I remember, right, because when we clicked on create, we didn't specify one, so we didn't do that. I did just do a basic machine learning resource. I didn't do the advanced one. All right, so over here in ml.azure.com, if you didn't see the last video, what we did was we created an AutoML experiment, which you can see actually what we're going to do today will also create an AutoML experiment. But what we did last week was not use any code. So we clicked on this button and did everything by clicking through. Today, we're actually going to create some code. So once you get here, you'll head over to Notebooks. And like I mentioned, there is a tutorial that you can follow that will have the code for you. So I instead copied and pasted the code over so that I could make sure that I kind of go through it and understood it and ran it through myself. So that's why I'm in this test.ipynb file. Oh, here's our config files, just so we can check them out. So yeah, subscription ID, resource group, and workspace name. Nothing fancy. So I did do that. But if you don't want to try to read the tiny print on my screen and try to follow along, which I am going to try to zoom in a bit here so that you can see it a little bit better, which is a little difficult. I'll be moving that over in just a second. If you do want to follow along and you don't want to try to copy and paste all of my code from a video, then what you can do is head over to Sample Notebooks. And right here on this ... next to tutorials, you can click on clone. And what this will do will automatically create a folder over here called tutorials in your workspace with all of the files. And what we're going to do today is this regression auto ML NYC taxi data tutorial. And we're going to be using the IPYNB file. All right. But again, today I just created a test.ipynb file, which you can also do because I wanted to show you that you don't have to have the tutorial necessarily. That's helpful and useful, but if you wanted to just run your own, you can just create an IPYNB file. Okay, so I'm going to collapse this. When you get to this is literally a notebook inside of the Azure Machine Learning Studio in your browser. You could do the exact same thing in a notebook inside of VS Code. So if you've set up your Visual Studio Code environment, which, by the way, you can, if you go back to that resource that I mentioned at the beginning, the Azure ML SDK 11 resource, that does have links out to how to set up your local environment as well. So if you've set up your local environment, which means that you have Visual Studio Code, the Python extension for Visual Studio Code, and then you've also, I prefer to create an Anaconda environment, and you've installed things like Pandas and Scikit-Learn and the Azure ML SDK core and all of that. If you've done all of that, then you can do this inside of Visual Studio Code. I wanted to show you how to do it inside of Machine Learning Studio because this is still just completely authentic, and you could download this Jupyter Notebook file, and as long as your environment, your local environment matches, you can still run it. So in the video series that I mentioned, we do actually have, I actually start in Visual Studio Code, and then we upload the files into Machine Learning Studio, which is awesome. It seems like there's only 8 watchers over on Twitch, which is fine. We also are streaming to a bunch of other platforms too. So And the benefit of these is that they stay up afterwards. So I appreciate it. And hopefully with fewer viewers live, you can ask all the questions that you want to ask. All right. Yes, definitely recorded and uploaded later. So we've basically, all we've done so far is created a Jupyter notebook. If you are following along, one thing that you'll notice is that your compute up here is going to be grayed out. That's because the machine learning resource isn't going to create additional resources like a compute target for you if you're not going to use it. We don't want to waste your money for that, right? We would rather have you choose what you need for your experiments. Awesome. Someone is watching but has not started with Azure yet. So Azure is basically our cloud solution. Basically, I'm going to be doing some machine learning and data science without having to use my computer. I don't need to have a strong one. I just am going to use Azure resources. Since you won't have a compute node yet, what you'll do is click on New Compute, and this will open up this Select Virtual Machine. For this one, what I chose was the standard D2V2 virtual machine. So you would just click on that, click Next, add a name, click Create, and wait for it to be created. I really like this feature of using the Studio because it allows me to create what I need when I need it and not have to think about everything ahead of time, but not necessarily get stuck when I don't have it either. One thing that you'll notice is over here in the Studio, you also have access to all of these different types of resources that are available to you. And if we head over into the compute, we'll actually see that compute target that we created. We'll see that it's running and that the purpose of it is for basically our Jupyter notebooks. The neat thing, and we do show this inside of the video series, is that this is the same compute target that you could use inside of Visual Studio Code on your local machine if you decided to do that instead. So at this point, what you would have is an empty notebook and a compute that was hopefully starting to run. The first thing that we did here was just import some libraries that we need. But what are we going to do today? What is it that we're trying to predict? Today, we're actually going to be using a data set that is available in our sample data sets. There's actually a link to it here. It's in the blob storage somewhere. Again, that tutorial file, if you head over into the tutorials and head over into that regression automated ML.ipynb file, that's going to have that linked for you. So what we're doing is we're importing that data into our Jupyter notebook here. And from there, we are creating a data frame. We're calling it green taxi DF and just printing out the first 10 rows. So that's what this is doing. So first, we're just kind of importing some different libraries that we might need. For example, Pandas, Azure ML, being able to actually import that data set so that we can grab that from the open data sets. Date time, because we are going to be taking a date time column and breaking it apart. And then being able to grab the relative delta between dates. What we see when we do print out the first 10 rows is that we've got 24 columns, vendor ID, some pickup date time, drop off, passenger count, the distance of the trip, different locations, the pickup longitude and latitude, and the drop off longitude and latitude, some that aren't showing, how much the fare was, and a bunch of other things. Our goal today is to use essentially the distance of the trip to predict how expensive the fare will be for that taxi ride. So that's what our goal is today. We talked about in previous videos and in the stream about being able to decide what columns are useful for us when we're trying to decide, like make decisions about our predictions. And in this case, what we're really going to focus on is, remember, this was a New York taxi data set. So what we're really going to be focusing on is Manhattan. And the reason is, and I'm not too familiar with New York, but I do know that Manhattan is an island of sorts, right? I'm, again, not too familiar with New York. And the issue with going beyond Manhattan is that there are additional charges for crossing bridges or things like that. And that can be a problem. So, we want to try to avoid that. In this scenario, all we're trying to do is figure out a simple machine learning algorithm that will predict a simple ride fare within Manhattan's borders. So the first thing that we're going to do is take apart those date time features. And the reason is day, time of day of month, those things do actually matter when it comes to fare, right? If you use public transportation, you know that there are different costs for different days or times of days. And especially in New York, there's going to be different costs for, high commute times versus, casual Sundays. So what we've done here is created a function that basically takes in a vector, and I'll describe what that vector is in a second. And it just takes it apart and grabs the month, day, weekday, and hour, and separates that into 4 different variables, and then creates a series, which is basically a list, and returns that. And what we're sending in is the pickup date time. And what we're getting out is a series where we'll have values for each of these 4 columns. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply that to all of the rows. So this apply will do that to all of the rows in our data frame, essentially looping through them without having to loop through them. So what we get out of that is we still have that pickup date time and drop off date time and all of that. But in addition to that, we have these last 4 columns that are useful for us, that make a little bit more sense to us, and we can kind of sort through them. Why day of week ending with weekday with the parentheses? That's a really great question. That is a function of, I didn't mean to say the word function, but basically month in a date time like object, month, day, and hour are like features of that object, whereas weekday is something that gets calculated. It's calling a function to be able to calculate that. That is just a part of this date time function or library that we're using. So in this case, we're utilizing this tutorial to learn a little bit about this library. When you are writing this code from scratch, you will have pop-ups for, especially if you're using Visual Studio Code, that'll tell you and allow you to kind of fill in what's coming next, to give you indication to that. And as you can see, we can kind of hover over things, which allows us to get some information about that particular class. Alternatively, you can go into the date time library and look at the docs there. That is a great question. And then we're going to print them out, and we can see that we have those last 4 columns now. Now that we have those last 4 columns, no problem. We can drop a bunch of columns that we're not going to need. So for example, we can drop those date time columns now because they just don't matter. We have the day and month and time and the day of the week separately. We're not going to worry too much about the location IDs. I don't know if you remember, but up here when we were first looking at them, a lot of them were nan, not a number anyways. They were null. So there's probably not a lot of information there for us. And remember, we're really just trying to grab anything that started and ended within Manhattan. Can I try this in my free tier? You should be able to try this in your free tier. The last time I looked at it, which was last week, it was a part of the free trial subscriptions. We're just using a basic machine learning resource here. So we can remove all of those. Remember, we're not going to be worrying about like tolls and any extra charges, the surcharges, any of that. We're not worrying about that. We're not going to take into account the tip or payment type or things like that. These are just all of the columns that we can remove to be able to make that prediction. The total amount is the amount that we want to be able to predict. So that's why we're also getting rid of the fair amount. So what we're doing here is we're just creating this list of all of the names of the columns that we want to remove. And then we're saying for each item in that list, for each column, go into our data frame and pop that column off. So remove it. Y'all never need to apologize for asking questions. I will not know all of the answers. And that's what we're here to do, is learn. So feel free to continue asking. So we're removing all of our columns that we don't need. And then we're just going to print out the head again. This time we're printing out the first 5 rows. You'll see this often in data science and machine learning notebooks where you're just kind of constantly printing out the head. And the reason why we do this is because it allows us to make sure that what we intended to do is what we did do. So we can now see that a lot of those columns have been removed, and we're left with, you know, the ones that we care about, the day of the month, things like that. We're left with the latitude and longitude and total amount, the trip distance, how many passengers there were, etc. Another really great function that we can use in data science. Yeah, if you want to find this notebook, you can head over to the notebook tab in Machine Learning Studio. If you've already created the notebook, that's great. One thing that you can do is go into sample notebooks. If you don't want to clone this, you can actually just see that notebook. We're using this regression automated ml.ipynb. How similar is SDK to API? That's a great question. I'm not going to have a very elegant answer to that right this second, because it's one of those questions where it's like, you know the answer, but it's something that you don't necessarily think about all the time. So the SDK is the developer kit, right? So that's where you would essentially need to download the SDK, and you're able to kind of use that library within your code a little bit more in a development environment. Whereas an API is usually something that's more closed off, and you're just kind of making a call into it. That's not a very elegant solution. I'm sure there are plenty of other resources available. And I am going to write that one down though, because what I do after my streams is on Twitter, I do go back and questions that I'm not super great at answering live, I go back and I answer them live. And if you do have a better answer than me, please feel free to add it to the comments too. But let me write that down before I forget. SDK versus API. That's how I think about it, is the way I described it. All right, so another great function that we can use is the describe function. And what this does is it gives us an overview of all of our columns, and particularly if you have columns that are all numbers, which in this case ours are. It'll give you things like the count, So in this case, our data set has 24,000 rows. It gives us the mean, standard deviation, minimum, 25%, 50%, 75%, and maximum. So we can see, for example, vendor ID. This is only 2 different vendors. Yeah, SDK is kind of like offline and API is kind of like online. I think that's an effective way. There are other subtle differences though, so I will definitely check that out. All right, or answer. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to grab some, we're going to basically filter out our data frame with only Manhattan. Remember, we wanted to kind of exclude everything that's outside of Manhattan because we wanted to avoid all of those like extra tolls and things like that. So for example, we're going to use the query function. There's actually a number of ways that you can filter data out of your data frames. In this case, we're going to be using query. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new data frame called final df. And we're going to take our original data frame and we're going to query that. And we're only going to pull the rows where the pickup latitude is greater than or equal to 40.53 and the pickup latitude is less than or equal to 40.88. Okay? We're going to do the same for longitude, but different numbers. And so this is only looking at where a vehicle or a taxi picked up a passenger and make sure that the pickup was within Manhattan's borders. We're going to look at the trip distance and make sure that the trip distance is at least like a quarter mile. In this case, it's in miles, like at least that. And then we're going to say it's at least or at most 31 miles. This 31 is actually pulled from, and now I can't remember the name. Basically, it's finding the distance between 2 points. If you remember the name of that formula, feel free to drop it in the comments. But basically, we used the size of Manhattan and the latitude and longitude to be able to find the farthest distance that someone starting within that area could go to remain within Manhattan. We also want to make sure the passenger count is greater than 0. I didn't think there was, okay, so there are some times when there is no passenger. So that might mean that the taxi needs to get back somewhere. So we're going to exclude any time when they're not carrying passengers because there's no fare there. And also that the total amount is greater than 0. So notice that on this first line, what we're doing is we're saving the rows where this is true into a new data frame called final df, and we're grabbing them from green taxi df. As we continue through these next few rows, though, we're going to be looking only at final df, which is what was saved on the previous row, because we don't need to pull things from green taxi df. That would actually then defeat the purpose of the previous rows, right? So we're just kind of cleansing as we go. So our final df will contain all of our cleansed data, so all of those rows being removed. Once we do cleanse our data, we are able now to remove those latitude and longitude columns because it doesn't matter at this point. We know for sure we're within Manhattan. So we're going to do the same thing that we did above. We're going to save those into a list. We're going to loop through that list, and we're going to pop off each of one of those columns. Yes. I love this explanation. Machine learning is just querying the right data at the right time and maybe automating it, leveraging concepts of mathematical formulas. Yes, literally. It is basically kind of computerized statistics. Yes. There are some other pieces to it. But when you drill all the way down, yes, it's a great way to describe it. Thank you. What frameworks one must know to do machine learning with Python? What Python libraries? How much time does it take to become an expert? in Python libraries for a person who's an expert in SQL? That's a really great question. So I heavily use Pandas, NumPy, and Scikit-Learn. Scikit-Learn for the actual kind of like machine learning parts. Scikit-Learn is a really, really great library, and they have some amazing documentation that I highly recommend you check out. So we can head over and search for Scikit-Learn. And I'll plop this in here for us. And I'll make this a banner real quick. So Scikit-Learn is a really, really amazing kind of just useful tool for you if you're looking to get started. They do have some getting started links for how to, get started with their stuff. They've got user guides, they've got their API, they have examples, and a lot of the machine learning and data science that we do over here on Learn will reference that. So if you head over to Learn, you can also go into the browse, and you can search things like machine learning, and a lot of modules will pop up, and these will guide you through various types of machine learning exercises. You can also type in data science, and you'll get other ones. And you can even do things like, let's see, if you search for, I thought there was a way, maybe there isn't, but you can also search for roles. So for example, you can search on data scientist, or data engineer, or not business owner, data analyst. There we go. And you can see some learning paths that we who are aspiring for those roles or who are already in those roles. So I encourage you to check those out. How about C++? That's a great question. I have not personally done machine learning with C++, but yes, you can definitely use that. I just don't have experience with it. And Python makes it easy because it has libraries. What about other languages? Yeah, so yes, Python, that is the number one reason I like to use it, is because it has languages, or it has a lot of libraries, and it has a lot of tools available. And then, yeah, so I really love things like Microsoft Learn and things like these tutorials with examples, and even things like the tutorial that we can find in here. But someone did ask a question about, if I'm just copying and pasting, what am I learning? And honestly, it's just kind of up to you. So for example, here, I could just kind of say, and then we did this and click the green button, and then we did this and click the green button. But we're actually kind of taking this apart and trying to understand. And I encourage you, anytime you see code where it's asking you to copy and paste, to stop and say, well, could I be doing this a different way? Or why might I do it this way? Or what if I changed it this way? Or, read the instructions first, see if you can do it, and then look at what the code does. Do it once where you copy and paste, and then, anyways, I could go on for years about learning. I won't do that right now. Awesome. You're in Devops and just wanted to learn this, given that you have the resources. Awesome. And then, did I use ML for production? Great question. So I think you're talking about can you use this kind of thing in like a production level application? Yes, 100%. At the end, we'll show you kind of quickly how you can deploy if we have time. But there are some resources on how to do that. And could you pull data straight from the API of a certain product to make actual predictions as well? Yes, you definitely can. Different products are going to have APIs, may or may not have APIs where you can pull live data from them. So yes, 100%. All right. So we've removed those. And so now we can kind of describe this again, and we can see that now vendor ID, passenger count, for example, doesn't have any that are less than 1. Trip distance is at least 1/4 of a mile, etc. So then what we did, and this is where using Azure ML for me is nice, because remember when we were looking back at this machine learning resource inside of Azure, and I mentioned this config file. We even took a look at it. It literally was just our subscription ID, our resource group, and our workspace name. That's literally all it was. But when we head over into our code, if you've installed the Azure ML SDK, you can actually just grab your workspace from the config file. And the reason you would do this is because this workspace has all of that compute and data store and all of the resources that you need that aren't on your local machine that you can now leverage. Within the Azure ML SDK, you can actually create a workspace from scratch, like from the code. And our tutorials go through that. So I'll put up the banner for that tutorial again. These docs here have a lot of answers for that. So you can actually create it from scratch. And in our video series that I mentioned, that would be this one, we do actually go through that. We walk through creating it from Visual Studio Code versus elsewhere. Just a couple of quick questions here. Just finished a CS degree with an AI specialization and feels like it's hard to still know things, been studying on your own. You know what? I have been a professional developer for 10 years and 15 years since I first started learning, and I still feel like I don't know anything. You're not alone. Especially things like AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, they're still very much growing and very new. So yes, it is a learning journey. And I highly encourage you to continue that journey. Just find things that you're passionate about and that are exciting for you, and keep going. And shift from low-level coding to high-level coding, for example, using drag and drop for your data analysis solutions. That's a really great question. Yes. I mean, it definitely depends. I think that there is usefulness for all of the above. Last week, like I said, we did a no-code solution where we were able to do an AutoML experiment all with just no code. We just were clicking and choosing. That is very useful. But if you need to go in and do something specialized, or you want to, modify a machine learning algorithm or things like that, you might need to do some code. So I think that there is pretty much always, I mean, I can't say always, but going to be use for low-level coding or text-based coding or things like that. But those high-level coding where you do things like drag and drop, I think they serve a very real role in our professional world. It also allows more people to enter and discover things and have power over their own data and analytics without having to go get a CS degree, for example. All right, so we're going to continue on because we do only have about 10 minutes left. And I will try to get back to some of those answers. What we're doing here's our Scikit-Learn. So basically what we're doing is we're using the Scikit-Learn library to basically split our training data and our testing data. So with machine learning, again, go check out the video series because we go into depth about this. But basically what we're doing is we're taking our final data frame and we're splitting it, where 20% of our data is going to be reserved for testing and 80% of our data we're going to reserve for training our model. Then we're going to go into some auto ML settings, and these get a little tricky. Francesca actually did a whole video on how to choose these settings and the auto ML config. So, I highly recommend checking those out, as well as going through the docs. But basically, there's a few things to call out here. One is that as we're going through, so if you missed last week's stream, auto ML basically takes our data and takes our type of model where our data's can be used to yield the answer we want. In this case, it's going to be regression. And it runs it through, upwards of hundreds of different models to try to find the best one that gives you the most accurate predictions. So in this case, we're saying that for each iteration, we want a timeout of 10 minutes. And for our entire experiment, we want a timeout at 0.3 hours. Yes, we can stop early. We're choosing a primary metric here. We want our featureization to just automatically happen for us. We want our logging to go here, and we want N, so 5 cross validations. And you should check out the series for information about that. We're going to specify our training data, our debug log, our task is regression. And what we're trying to predict is the total amount. Then we're going to create an experiment all here within code, and we're going to run that. And this is the part that's going to take, upwards of an hour. And it could, if you kind of limit it, it could take less, but this is what's going to take a long time. And once that is done, you can start to explore it all within your notebook. And I go into that in the video series. But what's neat about using Azure ML SDK is that you can also head over here into experiments, and you can see that experiment that you just ran. And if you head over into that experiment, you can see the run. So we did just one run of this experiment so far. And within this run, we can head over to models and see all of the models that AutoML tested for us. It sorts it by the metric that we told it to kind of measure against. In this case, voting ensemble, that algorithm, was the best for getting the most accurate result by taking the location, day, time, trip distance, all of that, and predicting our total amount. We can also jump into this particular run and start to look through some explanations on it, start to look at the metrics on it, the outputs, and you can actually see this exact model and deploy it. We went into this a little bit more in the last week's stream, so I encourage you to check that one out. But this allows us, with just that minimal, it's still quite a bit, but minimal amount of code, to run our experiment over or across multiple different algorithms and discover the one that is the most accurate for what we want to do. And we did all of that inside of the notebooks, but it gets created here inside of our studio. And again, the exact same thing if you're doing this inside of Visual Studio Code rather than inside of the studio's notebooks. So that's basically what we have. I did want to go through a couple of the questions that I missed. I'd love to get into ML, but no idea where to apply it. Everything applicable seems to already been done, like speech. That's a really great question, or kind of comment on spaces, especially ones that are more ML is still somewhat emerging, but also has a long history. As someone mentioned earlier, it's based in statistics, right? I mean, it's what people have been doing when we were just looking at paper. I do think that there's still a number of openings and problems that need to be solved that your experience and your learnings through data science and machine learning can impact. Whether you are actually writing those machine learning models and algorithms and improving them, or you're using them in new applications, there's just so many absolutely incredible applications. And what I always encourage people to do is to treat machine learning, data science, just coding in general, all of these tools and skills that you're learning, treat those like tools and discover passions or interests that you have kind of outside of those and see where they can collide. So which do I prefer, learning through books or online learning? Both, all, really depends what I'm doing, depends how my ADHD is feeling that day, depends on if I'm cold and want to be next to a hot computer that's fan is spinning. It really, really depends. I treat them both very much like reference material. I prefer learning by doing. And so I might follow a tutorial step by step and then start to kind of do other things. And whether that's a book or something else kind of doesn't matter. But I do purchase books to kind of read through them and kind of understand them. Let's see, are there other questions here? Interested in bioinformatics. Is it hard to apply ML models into a research? Hi from Puerto Rico. Hello. That is a great question. And no, my husband actually is a bioinformatics scientist and does machine learning every single day. That is his entire job, is to improve on algorithms, to use algorithms, to clean data, to just kind of do all of that. And it is a huge part of it. It's actually pretty interesting to look at that industry and see that, especially when you look at smaller companies, the smaller companies tend to still be focused on, wet lab or kind of the science that they are used to doing. And so when he comes in with kind of these ideas of like, well, can we take that data and, do this and that and that? And he associates it with mass spectrometers. And so let's run our data through our samples through mass spectrometers and gather that data and find ways to improve it, because mass spectrometers aren't perfect, because the data that we're dealing with is like human data. Anyways, I'm not an expert, but I've heard him say these words before. Yes, that is a very big application of machine learning, is within bioinformatics. Great question. Can we start with no code and use code when we need to implement some advanced needs within the same solution in Azure ML? That is a really, really great question. Yes. Yes, to an extent. So as we kind of saw here, even though we created this AutoML run within our notebook, it does kind of appear where our AutoML runs would appear if we were to create it just with kind of clicking through. And we can actually take what we might have started in a no-code solution, so maybe one of these models or some of these output logs, and then or the data set, and then bring that back in. So when you do a no-code solution, your data set also gets created within Azure. And so if you've done some cleansing within that no-code solution and you've saved that to your data set, yes, you can pull that into your code. So yes, in this case with AutoML, there isn't kind of a clear, okay, let me open this up and see that just that one part to change it. But if you go into the designer, you start to get into that more gray area of being able to have a complete no-code solution and then start to replace pieces with code. So I encourage you to check out the Azure Machine Learning Studio Designer. There's a couple of example or sample pipelines that you can check out and try. And if you break it, you just delete it and start over. All right, it's more efficient than grid search. It would seem so. In this case, it would seem that our ensemble, what was it again? Our voting ensemble, is that the one that was highest? Yeah, our voting ensemble was definitely more. I don't know. I think grid search might actually just be like more manual, but yes. I am humble. I am learning. Couple goals. It's nice to be able to understand each other, but also not be saying the exact same thing all the time. What option would you recommend to develop a modern desktop app with Python? Oh, great question. I am not a Python expert. So I'm not necessarily the best person to go for that. It looks like a lot of apps from the 90s. Tinker looks like a lot of apps from the 90s. But there are some amazing folks that you can kind of reach out to for that. And in fact, our Microsoft Developer YouTube channel has a number of playlists all around Python that I encourage you to check out. So we've got a beginner series to blockchain. This is so hard to see. Whoa, even worse. Now you can see my subscriptions with things like Barbie, because I definitely have a 3-year-old. Beginner series to blockchain, Python for beginners. And there's like 4 series on Python to beginners. So I encourage you to check those ones out for sure. I am going to put this up as I continue to answer your questions. We do highly appreciate any survey responses that we can get to ensure that the type of content that I'm delivering to you is what you want to see and hear and listen to and engage with. So out of concepts, is there any free course for DevOps? That is a great question. Yes. So if you head over to Learn, we can click on DevOps engineer here. And we have 106 results for learning paths or modules on DevOps. So introduce DevOps Dojo, Azure Fundamentals, which go into some DevOps things, defining foundations, the foundation pillars for DevOps. Anyways, you can read through these. We have a number of resources here. Oftentimes our resources link out to other resources as well. And I'm sure that there's other ones. These are just the ones that I have at my fingertips when I'm not super familiar with a particular area. So these are the ones that I can show you. Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining me today. Again, I will be on Twitter. So if you ever wanted to reach out, feel free to share your experiences with me. If you completed this exact tutorial that we went through together, and you just want to say, hey, I did it, share that with me. I want to celebrate with you. I'll send you a fun gift back. You can either tag me at Dr. Guthels or with #LearnWithDrG. I am going to be taking a break for the holidays and spend some time with my family, but I will be back in January weekly. So be sure to tune in then. Otherwise, thanks again so much for joining me. I hope you all have a great morning, evening, afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all in the near future. Thanks, everyone. Bye.